The sun had barely begun to set, casting an orange glow over the old family estate as relatives mingled in the sprawling backyard. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and memories were revisited. For Sarah Montgomery, this year's family reunion was more than a gathering of distant cousins and familiar faces. She had a plan, a dark, resolute purpose, born from betrayal. Sarah had been married to Daniel for 8 years, a seemingly perfect partnership. They were the picture of stability, respected by family and admired by friends. But the foundation of their marriage had cracked under the weight of Daniel's indiscretions. When Sarah found out about his affair, the discovery cut even deeper. Her husband's lover was her own boss, Victoria Lang. The affair was bold, barely concealed, and impossible to ignore once Sarah stumbled upon it. A misplaced phone call, the whisper of voices, the scent of Victoria's perfume on Daniel's shirt. It all painted a picture Sarah could no longer ignore. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's devastation curdled into something dark and unyielding. Rather than confront him in private, she devised a plan for a confrontation that would shatter Daniel's carefully constructed facade. Tonight, surrounded by family, friends, and their closest kin, she would force him into the spotlight of shame. As the evening reached its peak and guests sat around a long candle-lit table, Sarah stood up. Her voice cut through the hum of conversation like a knife. "Everyone, I want to share something very important about Daniel and Victoria." The silence was palpable as eyes widened and breaths caught. Daniel's face blanched, a flicker of panic glinting in his eyes as he registered the threat in his wife's gaze. "Daniel and my boss, Victoria, have been having an affair for months," Sarah announced, her voice unwavering. "It's something I thought I should bring up, especially since Daniel was so insistent we gather together this year." Murmurs rose among the family, eyes shifting to Daniel and then to Victoria, who sat across from Sarah with a frozen, horrified expression. Daniel's jaw clenched, but he was lost, defeated under Sarah's unforgiving gaze. The aftermath was chaos. Some relatives attempted to diffuse the tension. Others expressed outrage. Daniel tried to pull Sarah aside, but she shrugged him off. In a bid to save face, Victoria excused herself from the table, retreating toward the mansion. Sarah watched her go, following her with her eyes until the woman disappeared. Just as the family thought the drama had passed, a sharp scream pierced the night. It came from inside the mansion, and everyone turned toward the sound. Seconds later, Daniel came rushing from the house, his face ashen, his hands covered in blood. Victoria was dead. Her body lay sprawled at the bottom of the grand staircase, her neck twisted unnaturally. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the pristine marble tiles. Family members began calling the police, but within minutes, accusations flew. She confronted Victoria. They argued. Daniel stammered. "She must have fallen. I swear. It was an accident." But to the gathering, the scene suggested something else. Daniel's shirt was splattered with blood, his face was scratched, and a small vase lay shattered near Victoria's body. Sarah, standing by the entrance, looked on without a hint of surprise or sorrow. Instead, she had a knowing look in her eyes, her expression resolute, almost satisfied. When the police arrived, they questioned Daniel relentlessly. His story seemed flimsy, full of inconsistencies and unexplained details. He admitted to being the last one to see Victoria alive and couldn't explain the scratches on his face. As they led him away in handcuffs, Sarah watched from the doorstep, her face blank, unreadable. She knew what everyone would believe, and she had anticipated it perfectly. For years, Daniel had hidden his lies behind a charming facade. Tonight, she had torn it all down and as she watched the police car disappear into the night, she whispered, "Goodbye, Daniel." Whether it was her design or simply her quiet revenge against two people who had wronged her, no one would ever know. But Sarah knew, and for her, that was enough. The reunion would forever remain a tragedy, a night filled with secrets, betrayal, and ultimately, justice twisted through her own cold, calculated hand. The days following Victoria's death were a blur of police interviews, family speculation, and endless whispers. Daniel was held in custody as the investigation unfolded, and Sarah moved through the days as if shrouded in an ethereal calm. Her expression betrayed no sign of sorrow or guilt, yet her silence spoke volumes to those who knew her best. At the funeral, Sarah was present but detached, wearing black and greeting mourners with a distant politeness. Her calm demeanor unsettled those around her, especially since Daniel's arrest had left more questions than answers. The police had failed to find any clear evidence proving he had pushed Victoria, but the circumstances made it hard to see any other outcome. Then came the evening when Detective Henry Scott appeared at her door. Scott was sharp, observant, and known for his ability to read between the lines. He'd noticed Sarah's stoic behavior, her unshaken appearance, and he'd been curious. After introducing himself, he sat across from her in her living room, the fire crackling softly between them. "Mrs. Montgomery," he began, "I'd like to hear about your marriage to Daniel. I understand you were aware of his affair with Victoria Lang." Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she took a slow sip of tea and set the cup down gently. "Yes, I knew about it. And I knew Daniel had been hiding things from me for months. I wanted him to be held accountable." "You exposed him to the entire family. That must have taken courage," Scott said, his voice laced with a hint of admiration, but edged with suspicion. "It was the truth," she replied with a small shrug. "A painful truth. I wanted him to feel what I felt. The betrayal, the humiliation. And when Victoria died, how did that make you feel?" Scott asked, his gaze fixed on her face. Sarah paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't want her dead, Detective, if that's what you're implying. But I'll admit, her death did serve its purpose." The detective studied her. "Do you remember where you were when Victoria died?" "I was in the garden," she replied coolly, her gaze never wavering. "With family, surrounded by witnesses." Scott nodded, scribbling in his notebook, but unconvinced. "Did you see Daniel go inside? Or Victoria?" "Daniel left first. Then a little while later, I noticed Victoria wasn't at the table," she replied, her voice even. "I didn't follow her, if that's what you're asking." But Scott had learned to look beyond what people said into what they didn't. Strange, isn't it? For a man to confront his mistress, and moments later she's dead at the bottom of the stairs. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that sent a chill through the room. "Detective, if you're suggesting I had a hand in it, I'd remind you I was with people the entire time." Scott smirked, but he didn't push further. Instead, he set down his notebook. "Maybe so, Mrs. Montgomery. But sometimes people plan things so well, they think they're untouchable." With that, he left, and Sarah was alone once again, the cold emptiness of the house pressing down around her. Yet, despite Scott's veiled accusation, she felt no fear. She had been meticulous in her planning. The family reunion had been the perfect storm, one she had orchestrated carefully, allowing suspicions to build and the truth to unravel itself in layers. Weeks passed, and soon it became clear that without definitive evidence, the case was crumbling. Though suspicion loomed heavily over Daniel, the lack of direct proof meant He would soon be released. The family whispered behind closed doors, but they began to accept the police's narrative of an accident. But Sarah wasn't done. On the day Daniel was set to be freed, she made one last move. She visited him, standing across from him in the dimly lit visiting room of the detention center. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken with exhaustion and despair. "I'll be out soon, Sarah. I'll clear my name," he said, his voice barely a whisper, laced with an edge of defiance. She smiled, a cool, unfeeling expression. "I know, Daniel, but I want you to know something first." "What?" He spat, bitterness etched in his gaze. "I knew," she said, her voice low, each word carrying a weight that crushed the remaining fight in him. "I knew the entire time. I knew about you and Victoria, and I was counting on her to make her move. You know as well as I do that you didn't kill her." Daniel's eyes widened, a look of horror dawning on his face as the realization sank in. You set this up." "It was never about revenge, Daniel," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "It was about justice, about showing you that some betrayals are unforgivable. Victoria had already taken so much from me. But you destroyed our life, our trust. You wanted her, but you'll never have her." He shook his head in disbelief, his hands trembling. "You framed me?" She simply smiled, turning away from him for the last time. As the door clicked shut behind her, she felt a weight lift. Her plan had been precise, her intent resolute. She'd woven a web so intricate that Daniel would be caught in it forever, haunted by what he knew but could never prove. Walking out of the detention center into the cool evening, Sarah Montgomery felt the chill of satisfaction spread through her. Several months later, the whispers surrounding Victoria's death and Daniel's suspected involvement began to die down. Released from custody due to lack of evidence, Daniel returned to a life that had become unrecognizable, a life marked by disgrace, isolation, and an ever-lingering cloud of suspicion. Friends avoided him, family members looked at him with doubt, and his career was in shambles. Victoria's death, though ruled an accident, had left a dark mark on him that time would never erase. Meanwhile, Sarah thrived, immersing herself in work and social circles with a renewed sense of freedom. She had managed to reclaim her dignity, and in the wake of Daniel's public fall from grace, sympathy for her grew. To the world, she was a strong woman who had endured betrayal and tragedy with grace. Yet, beneath the surface, Detective Henry Scott hadn't been able to shake his own doubts. Something about Sarah's calm resolve, her unshaken composure in the face of such a scandal, had left a gnawing sense of unease in him. She'd remained untouched by the chaos, almost as if she'd been waiting for it. He often found himself returning to the case files, rereading statements, studying the photographs from that night. One evening, he found himself once again studying a photo of the grand staircase where Victoria had fallen, noting the oddly pristine arrangement of a broken vase nearby. Victoria had been known for her balance and grace. A simple misstep seemed unlikely. Yet every path he followed led him back to the same conclusion. Sarah had constructed a flawless alibi, surrounded by witnesses who could place her in the garden. Frustrated, Scott decided to pay her one final visit. He arrived at her house unannounced, finding her on the back patio, a glass of wine in hand, as she gazed out over the garden. "Detective Scott," she greeted him with a polite smile, as though she'd been expecting him all along. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Scott took a seat across from her, setting his notebook aside. "I wanted to talk to you one last time about that night, Sarah. I think you know I haven't been fully convinced by your story." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened. I've told you everything I know, Detective. Daniel was the one who went inside after Victoria. Yes, Scott said, his gaze fixed on her. And yet, I can't help but feel there's more to it. You know, sometimes people have a way of tying up loose ends in a way that seems almost too perfect. She looked at him calmly, her expression unreadable. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Scott leaned forward, lowering his voice. Did you know, Sarah, that the way the vase was broken, it looked like someone had intentionally placed it there? It struck me as odd that there was so little damage, so little disruption around it. For a brief moment, a flicker of something crossed Sarah's face, but it was gone in an instant. She held Scott's gaze steadily. Detective, I understand you have a job to do, but your theory that I somehow orchestrated Victoria's death and framed my husband is, well, quite elaborate. I was outside with my family. If Daniel chose to argue with her and she lost her balance, that's something I couldn't have foreseen. Scott's eyes narrowed as he absorbed her words, the steeliness of her calm unsettling. Perhaps, he replied. But sometimes the truth has a way of catching up, even to those who think they're untouchable. Sarah let out a soft chuckle. Then I suppose I'll wait for that day, Detective. But until then, I have a life to live. With no more evidence to go on, Scott rose, defeated. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been outplayed. Behind him, Sarah watched his retreating figure, a small, satisfied smile spreading across her face as he disappeared down the path. Inside, Sarah set down her glass and closed her eyes. The web she'd woven was complete, and she knew it would hold. Daniel was forever tainted, his life in ruins. She was free now, released from the shadows of betrayal and deceit. She had her justice, not the kind found in courts, but a far darker, more enduring one. With a final deep breath, she turned and disappeared into the house, the last threads of the past fading as she closed the door on the life she'd so carefully dismantled. And as the night settled over the estate, it seemed that finally, Sarah Montgomery was untouchable.